Tick-tock, time to rock. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's watching from all around the world. I'm your friendly neighborhood philosopher, D. Wood. And with me now is the guy who taught your great-granddaddy about jihad, because that's how long he's been doing it. Robert Spencer. How you doing, Robert?
I am doing great, David. How are you, sir?
Good. Now, Robert, we are about to jump into this week in jihad. So, has some stuff happened this week before we even get started? Has anything happened this week? Because it seems quiet. There's no 9/11. There's no 7/7. This is a down week for jihadis. But is there stuff to talk about?
Very much so. This has been a very busy week for the jihad.
Wow.
Most people don't realize that it is going on every day. And at Jihad Watch, we cover it, but we never are able to cover all of it. There is always more.
And for anyone who hasn't been following Robert's website, the link is in the description box. Also got a link there to the greatest book on jihad there is, apart from maybe the Quran. Well, I guess the Quran doesn't give you the history of jihad, so it just gives you a playbook.
Yes.
It gives you a playbook. But I also have a link to Robert's book, The History of Jihad. If you don't have that book, you definitely want to get a copy. If you can read the entire thing, you'll see how absolutely relentless jihad has been for the past 14 centuries. And if you look at it and say, well, that's kind of a big book, at least get the chapter on Muhammad down, and then if you can, get the chapter on the rightly guided caliphs down and what they were doing. Awesome information. All right, now, Robert, before we jump into this week in jihad, I was wondering if you could just give everyone an idea of what jihad is.
David, jihad is a central concept in Islam. And it means struggle in Arabic, and there are very many struggles in Arabic, just as there are very many struggles in English. You can struggle to quit smoking or lose weight. You can also have a titanic civilizational struggle against communism, or in our case, for communism. And in the theology of Islam and the law of Islam, the primary meaning of jihad is warfare against unbelievers in order to subjugate them under the rule of Islamic law, which mandates a second-class status for them.
Now, you said that's the primary meaning, but you acknowledge that there are other meanings because, as you brought up,
Yes.
You can have a struggle against, let's say, weight or something like that. Because I remember this that campaign that's my jihad, what's yours? And it was all like, I struggle to get to the gym after dropping my kids off at school. That's my jihad, what's yours? And they made it look like, jihad is basically a struggle against anything. And so you're acknowledging that, yeah, insofar as what the word means, means struggle, so you can have a jihad against all kinds of things. But it looks like, according to you, what you're saying is that when people are trying to make it sound as if that's the main meaning, just your daily struggles in life against anything, it's not the main meaning.
Exactly, precisely. That is the problem with that campaign, My Jihad, that it was misleading. It was trying to give the impression that jihad was entirely benign by invoking benign usages of the term. None of those were wrong. All of them were right. But they were not the only meaning of jihad, and they weren't even the main meaning of jihad in Islam. And if you read the Quran and you see all the uses of jihad, which is sometimes difficult, until you get my critical Quran, which has been delayed by the paper shortages but will be out in May, you will read most translations of the Quran in English and you'll get strive hard in the way of Allah. And you won't know necessarily, unless you have studied, that strive hard is jihad. And that the primary understanding in Islamic theology of those passages exhorting people to strive or wage jihad in the way of Allah is warfare, and primarily warfare against unbelievers.
Now, Robert, I have to confess, you're sounding a little bit like an Islamophobe when you're saying these things. So Before we jump into the topic of Ilhan Omar's Islamophobia bill, what is Islamophobia?
Well, you know, David, that's the key question. That's the burning question. And since you mentioned Ilhan Omar's Islamophobia bill, I have to note that it does not define Islamophobia. And that the big problem that we face with this Islamophobia bill is that Islamophobia as a term has been used in the recent past for two quite distinct phenomena. And they are, in the first place, vigilante attacks against innocent Muslims, which are never justified. And second, honest analysis of the motivating ideology of jihad terrorism, which is always necessary. And in order to stigmatize and silence that analysis, they use the same term as they use for the vigilante attacks, so as to give the impression that if you speak honestly about what jihad means for Muslims and what jihad attacks actually are and what motivates them, then you are leading to those vigilante attacks against innocent Muslims and therefore must be silenced. And that's the insidious aspect of her bill.
Well, that's disturbing because in philosophy, more specifically in the branch of philosophy called logic, that's a logical fallacy called equivocation, where you change the meaning of a term. And so what you're saying is that someone would go up and say, hey, some random person went and attacked a Muslim because that person is a Muslim. You're against that, aren't you? Yes, I'm against that. Well, then you're against Islamophobia. So you're against Islamophobia, aren't you? Well, yeah, if that's what Islamophobia is, then I'm against Islamophobia. But you're saying that then they changed the definition. Okay, well, then you're against anyone who says anything against Islam or anyone who actually quotes the Muslim sources accurately and tells what it calls for. And so you're against all that, too. And so it's this idea of what we want is to shut down criticism of Islam and any honest report on what it calls for as far as calls for the violent subjugation of the world, calls for the killing of apostates, allows men to beat their wives into submission, allows the victors in a war to take the women and girls as their sex slaves. When we say that, you want to shut that down. But you can't say, especially in Western context, you can't say, hey, you can't criticize taking women as sex slaves. You can't do that, because then people say, well, of course you can. Of course you can criticize that. What are you talking about? So you have to say, are you against this phobia? Well, yeah, I'm against the phobia, but then you're saying they change the meaning of the phobia as they go along.
Oh, yeah. And I think it's no accident at all that the bill does not define Islamophobia precisely so that that kind of equivocation can be carried out. Mm-hmm. And that's also underscored by the fact that the bill itself talks about wanting to stop racial attacks against Muslims. Now, Islam, as you and I both well know, is not a race.
Racial attacks against Muslims.
Exactly.
So now, would Christians and atheists be a race then too?
Well, they're not mentioned, so I don't know. But you know what's funny about this is that also this week in Jihad, after years and years of calling people who are critics of jihad terror and Sharia oppression racist, a Muslim professor this week wrote an article explaining how terrible it was to act as if Muslims were a racial group. And yet that's exactly what Ilhan Omar's Islamophobia bill does. And it gives the impression that any criticism of Islam is going to be taken as incitement to violence and thus must be silenced.
Yeah, because that's the disturbing part, right? In that you've experienced this thousands and thousands of times. I've experienced this thousands and thousands of times. We say something obvious and straightforward, something that Muslim apologists, anyone who's being honest, will acknowledge. The penalty for leaving Islam is death, and we'll say something like that, and then we will be called Islamophobes for saying this. So here's what's disturbing: you've got the government now says, okay, now we've got this special envoy who's tasked with combating Islamophobia. We're not defining what Islamophobia is, but as long as Islamophobia is not defined, tons of people say that what we do is Islamophobia, even if it's just straightforward reporting facts. So now, as far as this term without any definition is going to be part of law, then we're under the government is now supposed to combat us because we're because we're Islamophobes, right?
And the groundwork for this has been being laid for years, and it all works in the same direction. For example, I was just telling you right before we came on that I myself am a violent extremist. And
I'm glad you're admitting this.
The Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism, which is the counterterror arm created by Microsoft, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, all of those social media giants. They published a list of groups that they intend to silence and drive off the internet altogether because they are either terrorists or violent extremists.
Got to be one or the other.
Okay. Category was my website Jihad Watch. And now I thought this was not only absurd but libelous, and so I got a lawyer to write to these people and demand a retraction and so on and so on, and they refused. They said, look at Jihad Watch. It's talking about violent actions by Muslims. That's going to lead to that's incitement to violence against Muslims. Now, this is absolutely absurd. The only genuine incitement to violence is if you're saying go and be violent against some group, which I've never commanded or condoned or approved or called for any violence. But what they want to do is portray any speech critical of Islam as leading to violence and shut it down on that basis. And now the Islamophobia bill is going to help accomplish that as well.
Yeah, and what shocks me is the just complete hypocrisy as far as what you were just saying. And let me go ahead and read what Ilhan Omar said on the House floor when she was promoting this. She said, until everyone is free to practice their religion, no one is. Now, that's just it's just an idiotic comment. Until every last person in the world is free to practice their religion, not one person is. That's ridiculous, right? So notice, if everyone in the United States were completely free to practice their religion, as long as one person in Pakistan isn't, then no one's free. So it's kind of a silly comment. But let's take that seriously for a second. Until everyone is free to practice their religion, no one is. Now, notice the conundrum that this leaves us in. Let me go ahead and pull up a passage by Muhammad. All right, here we go. This is Sahih Muslim. This is Muhammad. It is reported on the authority of Abu Hurairah that he heard the Messenger of Allah say, Sahih Muslim, number 34, I have been commanded to fight against people, not people who are attacking me, everyone. Notice, I've been commanded to fight against people till they testify to the fact that there is no God but Allah, and believe in me that I am the messenger from the Lord, and in all that I have brought. You have to believe everything this man brought as revelation. And when they do it, their blood and riches are guaranteed protection on my behalf, except where it is justified by law, and their affairs rest with Allah. So here Muhammad says, I'm commanded to fight people until they say that there's no God but Allah and I'm his messenger and they believe in everything I say, which would make you a Muslim. Right? So Muhammad says, I've been commanded to fight you until you become a Muslim. Now, it seems like if you've got these organizations and if you've got Ilhan Omar saying, until everyone is free to practice their religion, no one is. Muhammad is saying no one's free to practice their religion unless that religion is Islam. That's what Muhammad is saying here. No one is free to practice their religion until they believe in Islam. And he's coming to fight you if you have the wrong religion. So if we believe what Ilhan Omar is saying, then we should say, oh my goodness, we need a special envoy in the government to combat this sort of teaching and to expose this sort of teaching. But we don't have that. What we have is Robert Spencer. He's exposing the teaching. I'm exposing the teaching. And we're called Islamophobes, and we need the government to crack down on us. This is why. Do you see why I'm confused, Robert? This is this quotation right in front of us, and the many other in the Muslim sources are things that if we agree with Ilhan Omar, if we agree with that federation that called you a violent extremist, if we agree with what they say about what constitutes violent extremism or a phobia, if we agree with them, then we should all be going after the teachings of Muhammad. We should all be exposing the teachings of Muhammad. And yet, when we do that, when we do what everyone says we're supposed to be doing, then they attack us for exposing it, and we're the enemies, not the actual teachings that call for violence against unbelievers just for being unbelievers.
Right. There's no consistency. It's total hypocrisy, because what it really is, the Islamophobia bill, that is an attempt to bring Sharia blasphemy laws to the United States. Sharia blasphemy laws criminalize criticism of Islam. The dhimmis can't complain about their subjugated status, because if they do, it will get even worse. Their contract of so-called protection will be revoked, and their lives will be forfeit. So they learn never to say anything negative about Islam, Muhammad, or the Quran, and they know that if they do, they're liable to get killed. It'll be the same thing here. If this bill passes the Senate and becomes law, then this will be an extension of that prohibition on criticizing Islam.
Yeah, and we did have a question along these lines. Zoraida says, has this bill passed already? My understanding is that it's passed the House, but now it goes to the Senate. The president has already said he's on board with it. So basically, if it gets through the Senate, it'll be approved by the president, and then it's
very
law.
Likely. Since the Democrats control the Senate, and since the Republicans don't really have a clue any more than the Democrats about what this is all for, what it's intended to do, it's very likely to pass.
So if it passes the Senate, and then it will be signed off by the president, then what we will have is an official part of the federal government that is assigned to combat Islamophobia, where Islamophobia will be anything they decide that it means, because it's not defined.
Exactly.
And you and I, again, just to recap, you and I are called Islamophobes repeatedly simply for stating what Islam teaches, simply for talking about Muhammad or the Quran. We're called Islamophobes for that.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And so that's the idea, to silence you and me and every one of us who speaks out about the motivating ideology behind jihad terror and about the sources of the other oppression that we see coming out of people who observe Sharia.
And so Ilhan Omar says, until everyone is free to practice their religion, no one is. We look in places like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and so on. And if you go around practicing your religion and you're not a Muslim, or even if you are a Muslim and you're from the wrong sect of Islam, if you're just from the wrong sect of Islam, you're not free to practice your wrong sect of Islam in many places. And so according to Ilhan Omar, these are the problem areas. And yet it turns out that we are not allowed to speak against what's going on there, because we will now have the federal government after us.
Right.
Interesting.
It would be Islamophobic. If what you and I do is Islamophobic, then there's no way you can stand and criticize any kind of violence or oppression that is justified in Islamic law.
So if someone, as we all know, Muhammad said repeatedly, if anyone leaves his religion, kill him. If anyone leaves his Islamic religion, kill him. And so if someone in a Muslim country says, you know what, I now reject Islam, I want to become a Christian, or I want to become a Hindu, according to Ilhan Omar, until that person is free to practice his religion, no one is. And yet Muhammad told his followers to execute these people. And so if someone in a Muslim country is executed for leaving Islam and choosing another religion, choosing to follow and believe in another religion, and we say, hey, that's wrong, you can't do that, the federal government's coming after us, not against the person who's executing people for leaving Islam.
That's it.
Interesting stuff.
It's sort of, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation has foreshadowed this for a long time. I've seen this in their Islamophobia Observatory, where they list so-called incidents of Islamophobia. And so, for example, a Muslim cleric would say something like, kill the mushrikeen, the those who associate partners with Allah, wherever you find them, which is, of course, a quote from the Quran, the verse of the sword. And then I would say at Jihad Watch, this Muslim cleric said, kill them wherever you find them. And that would go in the Islamophobia Observatory, but not what the original cleric had actually said. It's that they don't want these things reported, they don't want them quoted, they don't want them known. And that's really what they consider to be Islamophobia when we start to understand what the jihad imperative is really all about. That's what they want to keep us ignorant and complacent so that we do not resist it.
Very, very disturbing stuff here. And I have to say, Robert, I look at some of the more devout, what some of the more devout Muslims say about people like Ilhan Omar. And they say, she's not a real Muslim because she's siding with, she's siding with LGBTQ stuff and siding with all this other stuff. She's not real. And yet what's amazing is even these people who defend radically different things somehow agree. What they all agree on is you can't talk about Muhammad and the Quran. No matter how liberal or left you go, you still can't talk about Muhammad, and the government itself has to crack down on you. And another disturbing thing is that the social media platforms all end up falling in line on this stuff, right? Like if you're, let's say, if your name is Ali Dawa on YouTube, you can literally call for the execution of people like the apostate prophet. You can call for his death and say, I'm going to be watching as this man is executed as soon as we get our way. YouTube will respond, well, that's just part of lively debate. If I say Muhammad's a false prophet, I will actually get banned. That's what I got banned for the other day. I said Muhammad's a false prophet. Don't believe in him, believe in Jesus. I got banned, lost my appeal, got a 7-day ban, video taken down. Fortunately, we were able to get that to someone who had a shred of common sense to say, okay, if you want to make that the rule, fine. That's not in the rules. That's not in the rules that I can't say Muhammad's a false prophet. So they restored it. But notice, but that happens all the time. That happens almost every week with me, that they take down something where I said something about Muhammad. And so what you end up with is you have Sharia,